Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you for making it out on a nice, rainy Thursday night. Traffic was a bit heavy. It's my pleasure to welcome you here at the University of Michigan-Dearborn and to welcome our panelists for this forum on race in the region. I would be remiss if I didn't start by thanking all of the people that made this possible. And it's going to be a bit of a list. It took a bit of time. So the University of Michigan-Dearborn College of Arts, Science, and Letters, the University of Michigan-Dearborn's Enrollment Management and Student Life, Office of Student Engagement, and their Diversity and Inclusion programs, the Social Sciences Department here, the Center for Arab American Studies, the Office of Metropolitan Impact, Urban and Regional Studies, Geography, and the Hub for Teaching and Learning. In addition, if that weren't enough, the Taubman School of Urban Planning at the University of Michigan, the Office of Research and Special Programs at the University of Michigan, and I don't think she's here, but I would be remiss to not thank Belinda Solis, the Administrative Specialist in Social Sciences, who made quite a bit of this possible. So the event tonight on race in the region, I guess the way that it'll work, I want to give you a bit of an intro and talk about how this came to be. And then I will tell you a bit about the panelists that we have here, and then I'll turn it over to them. We'll talk a bit about whatever it is, wherever they lead us in this topic, and then we'll open it up to you for question and answer. And then after that, we'll all have some food together. So this panel comes from an introduction to Urban and Regional Studies class. So that's a 300-level class here at the University of Michigan-Dearborn. A number in the audience, if you guys are in that class, can you raise your hands? Yeah, this is great. So this is all their idea, so thank you for coming. They made this happen. But the Orville Hubbard statue reappeared in Dearborn in April of last year, unexpectedly. It popped up. And that caused a bit of consternation and kerfuffle, and people were wondering, why it would reappear. And then later that year, Charlottesville happened, right? We were also again thinking about monuments and talking about monuments and what was going on. And so for me, I was curious how we might be able to think about race, place, and monuments together. What can we do for an intro to urban and regional studies classes where we can talk about these issues and think about these issues. And so that's what we did. And out of that, we were fortunate enough to, Andrew's here, to work with the Dearborn Historical Society and with David Good, who sits on that board and wrote the book on Orvie. But they both came to our class and gave a presentation about Orville Hubbard and the statue and where things were. And they said, we wanted to have a forum. But the mayor said no. And after they left, our students said, we should have a forum. And I said, sure. Who do you want to bring? Well, let's start with Stephen Henderson. I said, really? You're going to start with Pulitzer Prize winner as your first person you're going to ask to come to this forum? Okay, who's next? And as you see, we go down the list. It's the most distinguished group we have here. It doesn't go in any order. You guys chose your seating. You chose your seating. But they did a good job of thinking through who and why they wanted them to be here, and for very, very different reasons. So I feel really fortunate that we've actually been able to make this happen. Right? We talked about what is it that I guess we also talk in that class, like, what is it about organizing, what is it about make things that makes things happen, is you create something that wasn't there before. And by doing that, there's other possibilities. We'll go from there. So monumental space, right? What is this thing? We're going to talk about more than the monument, but I'm going to start a bit right there and focus. What I want to focus on is the movement of Orvie Hubbard for a bit, like the statue itself. I think this is as a geographer, I find this particularly interesting, how it's moved. And it raises a lot more questions and ones that can open up other things. So when it was perched atop a marble base outside the old Dearborn City Hall, the diminutive statue was indeed a monument, right? It was a big 10-foot tall monument. And there was monumental space around it. It was in this public space. And then at each subsequent stop, the pedestal has lowered, right? Until now, the statue is at ground level where most passing by either meet it or are looking down on it. It's an awkward space where it's at now. It's outside the Historical Society on a sidewalk. It's neither monumental or historical. It's both cartoonish, and at the same time, it pulls forward a lot of the bigotry and beliefs that some have not been willing to let go in the city's power structure. If not complicit in that, not courageous enough to confront. Right? So it has all of those pieces at play in this very kind of awkward space. So for our panelists, they're not sitting in the order that I put their bio, so I will move that around. And I will, I'll go ahead and start with on my left. We have, to my left, John Pagliari, scholar, author. He's the associate professor of English at Wayne State University. He teaches and writes about the history and culture of Detroit, especially in the ways its images circulate outside the city, as the Motor City, Motown, the Arsenal of Democracy, and the City of Ruins. His current project, Keywords for Late Capitalism, traces the history of economic concepts in mass media, uncovering the history and common use of popular terms like accountability, entrepreneur, and innovation. He is a true entrepreneur of himself. Sorry, I added that line for myself. The project can currently be found online, but there's a book version coming out in 2018 for Haymarket Books. Lester Spence, award-winning scholar, author, and journalist. He's associate professor of political science and Africana studies at Johns Hopkins University. He's published a number of academic articles and numerous essays and opinion pieces in popular press. His books Stare in the Darkness, The Limits of Hip-Hop and Black Politics, won the W.E.B. Du Bois Distinguished Book Award. His most recent book is Knocking the Hustle Against the Neoliberal Turn in Black Politics. We had an interesting conversation this afternoon. Dr. Spence grew up in Inkster and watched Orville Hubbard's funeral from his junior high. Maybe we'll talk about that. Namira Islam is a Bangladeshi-American lawyer and graphic designer. She's based in Michigan and is the co-founder and executive director of the Muslim Anti-Racism Collaborative, or Muslim Art, an organization that provides racial justice education and training. Her legal background includes work in prisoners' rights litigation, international human rights law, and poverty law. She's written for multiple publications, delivered lectures and trainings throughout the United States, and provided commentary and analysis on identity, current events, and social justice narratives for radio shows, documentary films, and other media worldwide. And finally, I will give him an introduction, but most people know who Stephen Henderson is, but he is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist. He's currently the host of Detroit Today on WDET. He has written for the Detroit Free Press, the Chicago Tribune, and the Baltimore Sun. He's a graduate of the University of Michigan, and he spearheads the Tuxedo Project, which seeks to renovate and abandon his abandoned childhood home as a space for a writer in residence. So with that, what I want to do is I sent out some topics for discussion, but I want to give each of our panelists 3 to 5 minutes to really talk about or think about the theme of the evening, and in particular, thinking about perhaps a bit of Orville Hubbard, his statue, and his legacy. So would any of you like to go first? All right, jump Pat.
The last shall be first.
The last shall be first, and the first shall be last.
Nicely done.
Should I sit or should I do this?
You can stay seated.
Okay.
Yeah, the microphone's right there.
Well, I wanted to open just by talking a little bit about the politics of statues in public space, which, as Josh was alluding to, the controversies, particularly, I guess, most famously around Confederate statues in Charlottesville, New Orleans, and other places, in which I think to the degree that there is a controversy about the Hubbard statue, it's part of that sort of thrust, and that is itself a consequence, as you also sort of mentioned, of a movement behind it. So the only reason we're talking about the statue at all, or statues at all, isn't because we're connoisseurs of equestrian statues or public art, or bad public art, as most public statues are, but because of the political movements that have challenged not just the statues, but of course challenged the racist structures that the statues represent. But I was thinking about, as I was thinking about this afternoon, I was thinking about this poem by Robert Hayden, Detroiter, Michigan scholar, who has a poem about a statue of Frederick Douglass, and he talks about what he calls statues rhetoric, which he means by the kind of cold, unspeaking dullness of most statues, which don't represent anything living or vibrant to us, but something cold and kind of anodyne in most cases. And many people, I think, in response to these kind of controversies around the statues, the Confederate ones, the Frank Rizzo statue in Philadelphia, sort of the Orville Hubbard of Philadelphia, I guess, is another one that we can add to the list. Many people point out, well, statues are meaningless. Focusing on them is just spectacle or symbolism. Why focus on a statue of a dead politician when there are so many more important issues to talk about, as if a functioning, healthy society, I'm not saying we are one, but as if a functioning society can't, walk, chew gum, tear down a statue, or move a statue, and address those other kind of fundamental issues all at the same time. And on the other hand, there's the argument that people make about burying or suppressing history instead of tearing down, say, a Confederate statue. Why not contextualize it or place some sort of some plaque in front of it that establishes contemporary arguments about it? And I think in a lot of these arguments, there's a few major points that often go missing. And first, there's just the basic point that public monuments, as opposed to memorials, which are sort of more of a private matter and often more of a private concern, public monuments express public values, especially when they're in public space. And so the matter of what a monument expresses is implicitly a question of what a society believes and holds dear. And so the question of what Orville Hubbard believed and held dear becomes a question of what we hold dear when there's a statue of him in a public space. And then secondly, there's the other point, which is that statues are, as Robert Hayden suggested, at some level meaningless. And what I mean by that is, there's nothing more undistinguished in a lot of ways than like an old equestrian statue. We never, and I haven't even seen the Orville Hubbard statue, so I don't know how boring it is or not. In fact, I didn't even know there was one until people started talking about moving it. So, which is the point? It's not that great of a statue. I mean, we don't talk about these things until there's a campaign to remove them or to move them. So the conflict over the statues is clearly not about the statues, but about something else. And I was also just thinking, in terms of what we have controversies about. We have controversies about Confederate generals, Confederate officials, 1970s mayors, in the case of Frank Rizzo, and then Hubbard. But I had students in one of my classes doing a research project about memorials of the Confederacy and the Union, or rather memorials to the Union in Detroit, since there are no memorials to the Confederacy, to my knowledge. And there used to be a John Brown plaque. Frederick Douglass and John Brown had a meeting before the Civil War, and there was a plaque in downtown Detroit commemorating the site. And it was removed quietly where it was scrapped, or I don't even know what happened. It's not there anymore. It disappeared. One of my students went to write his paper about it and found it wasn't there. So he had to write his paper about the fact that it wasn't there instead, which was actually more interesting. But there was no controversy about that, and so I think it's interesting that that's not a matter of public hair tearing and argument, but Orville Hubbard's is. And then finally, just before I stop talking for a moment, on the question of statues are mere symbolism. I think it's interesting we're talking about Orville Hubbard tonight because if his history, and especially our present, because Orville Hubbard, I think, probably seems like a very familiar figure to those of us paying attention to national politics. He seems a lot like Donald Trump. That's what I'm alluding If his history and our present tell us anything, it's that symbolism matters quite a lot. Politics were a perpetual publicity stunt to him, and so questions of symbolism actually sort of go to the heart of what he was about and what his legacy was about, and it's not a simple sideshow for that reason. So that's what I wanted to say.
Okay. It's really good to be home. So this is how. So my first job, the first job that I really wanted, the first job I had was Wendy's, but that doesn't count. But the first job I really wanted was at B. Dalton Bookstores at Fairlane. First job I wanted. 6th through 8th grade, I went to Sacred Heart up the street. My mom there was this Greek joint that used to make baklava that my mom would get baklava from. I borrowed my first D&D books from the library, the Bryant Library, like weeks and weeks and weeks in a row, right? So it's funny, because I've spoken at home before. Like I've been to the University of Michigan several times. Every time Stephen Canny gets me on the show, I've spoken at the in Detroit. But this is actually the closest to home, right? So why I'm gonna actually connect that to Hubbard. Hubbard's funeral really was right next door to Sacred Heart when I was actually in school. One of the things that we should talk about when we talk about this current movement is the decision what to do with the statues once there's a move against them, right? And then in the case in which the statue is kept, how do you deal with this new knowledge? Although it's not really new. Like I knew as a 6th grader that Hubbard was a racist. But what do we do with this new knowledge? So I'm going to read you the plaque, or part of the plaque that now attends or is next to the statue. Orville L. Hubbard was mayor of Dearborn for 15 terms. Wow, that's gangster. From 1942 to 1978. That's what it was, a gangster.
When did he start?
1942 to 1978. One of the longest tenures of any full-time U.S. mayor. Born near Union City, Michigan, Hubbard served in the Marine Corps from 22 to 25. Graduated from Detroit College of Law. Settling in Dearborn, he ran unsuccessfully for public office 9 times before becoming mayor. Sometimes labeled a political boss, Hubbard was a colorful, controversial figure who won re-election by landslide margins despite a liable judgment, a grand jury investigation, a governor's removal hearing, and a federal civil rights conspiracy trial. Then they acknowledge his segregationist history, right? But this is the point this is the thing I think that's really interesting. Largely because of disproportionately high property taxes levied against Ford Motor Company and other businesses, he was able to keep homeowners' taxes low and still provide what he called the world's best public service while creating Dearborn's signature facilities. Now, when we talk about race and racism, we tend to talk about race and racism as if it were primarily attitudinal, right? So, like a lot of our conversations about police killings, for example, are about, in some cases, implicit bias testing. Like we need to make sure we kind of root out the cops who may have explicit or implicit attitudes against African Americans, right? A number of scholars, of my colleagues, write routinely about microaggressions. That is the way that interpersonal dynamics kind of affect them. And yes, that's a real thing. That is a real thing. And again, I talk about Fairlane. The first encounter I had with the police was being yanked off of a Wayne 200 bus. Me and 3 of my friends from Inkster, we were yanked off that bus and accused of stealing Atari 2600 video games. We didn't even really have pockets, right? My mom had to end up coming to get us. So yes, and some of that was driven with animus, or by animus. But what does that miss? What that misses is that racism is a political project that has the consequences of hoarding resources, right? Now, here's a way to think about it. I went to Sacred Heart 6th through 8th grade. Why did I go to Sacred Heart? I went to Sacred Heart because my mom realized the schools in Inkster were really, 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 really bad. Why were the schools in Inkster really, really, really bad? How do we determine school quality? Right? Part of that is a function of local property taxes. Right? What's Inkster's population? Inkster's population is probably, it felt like it was 70, 80%, but it was a majority black town. Right? We think about city development. City development, we can think about city development politically as the consequence of natural population growth, right? So as populations increase, the numbers of cities in a place increases, right? But here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna give you two slopes, right? And I think I'm gonna get the direction right. This is the slope of city development over time, right? This is population growth, right? That is to say, there's a gap between the population size, how populations increase over time, and the creation of cities. Why, if it's not population, why do we have city development increase like this? The primary reason, and this is, I'm giving a shout out to Nancy Burns, who's on my dissertation at the University of Michigan, is because individuals and actors who create cities are interested in hoarding resources and keeping them for themselves, right? So when we think about race and racism, we can think about Orville Hubbard and that first part, him being a segregationist, but you have to take into account that second part. He's able, think about this, Amazon right now is going, every city that can is throwing billions of dollars at Amazon to get them to locate there. Hubbard actually got Ford to pay massive taxes. Where did those resources go? To public services. Who got access to those public resources? I went to that library until I stopped. Why did I stop? Not because the librarians loved me. It was because Dearborn passed a law in the early 80s to withhold public services to anybody, to Dearborn residents. How did they know if you were a Dearborn resident or not? What they said was an ID card, but Dearborn's population was 95% white. Why did I have to go to Sacred Heart? Again, I had to go to Sacred Heart largely because my schools in Inkster suck. Why do my schools in Inkster suck? Because the population that was in Inkster didn't have the capacity to actually raise the revenue to make sure their the school quality is increased. In fact, it's interesting, and then after this, I'll let go because there's more to talk about. There was a move afoot in the early 70s to actually desegregate the entire school system. Not just the Detroit schools, not just the Inkster schools, but the entire state school system. Milliken v. Bradley. The argument was that the schools were so segregated, the only way to desegregate them was to basically force inter-district busing. So what ended up happening is they allowed busing within a school district and within a city, but they didn't allow inter-district, right? So that is to say that if the law would have gone as planned, Inkster kids would have been able to go to Dearborn schools, right? Detroit kids would have been able to go to Grosse Pointe schools. After that, Inkster kids could only go to Inkster schools. Detroit kids could only go to Detroit schools, right? What does that do? That further hoards resources, and that further creates the incentive for racial segregation. We talk about Dearborn and Hubbard, but we could easily be talking about Livonia. When I was a kid, Livonia was probably 90% white. We could easily even be talking about kind of a working class, predominantly white city like Garden City. Definitely a city like Retford. So it's important. So what I think is interesting about that moment, about the Orville Hubbard thing, is not just the removal of the statue itself, but the opportunity we now have to have conversations like this, made possible by that minor political act of putting a plaque next to the statue, right? So on that note, we'll have a lot more conversation over here.
Thank you.
It is so good to be here. I am also a Wolverine, so it's great to be here. And
Go blue.
Yes. So what I wanted to talk about, and I love kind of what's already been said because it really helps me kind of come in with my perspective, which is specifically around human rights education and training. But one thing that I'll say before that is that my parents immigrated from Bangladesh in the 80s. So my dad came to Wayne State University for his master's in engineering, and they followed the patterns of white flight out of Detroit when I was 2 years old because of some of the impacts of systemic racism on resources within Detroit. So we moved to Livonia, and then from there we moved to Novi. And as a child growing up in these cities, I was definitely one of like the only people of color. For me, it was something where thinking about the dynamics, the demographics, I always felt othered and alienated in those spaces. But the reality is that my parents were choosing for a better support system, right? Better schools, better safer neighborhoods, all these different things that people traditionally go to these suburbs for, but it entrenches racism. And for somebody who is a non-Black person of color, it really reifies some of the issues around model minority myths and a lot of this intra-people of color dynamics that further entrench systems of white supremacy, right? So that's like this other larger context of the Southeast Michigan kind of Metro Detroit region, given the communities of color that are not Black, that are within this region as well, is that for us, we have proximity to whiteness in certain ways that mean that we do get some access to resources, but in other ways we don't. And so there's some interesting dynamics there when it comes to issues of community solidarity or community kind of interactions with each other. From a larger context, though, the argument that usually is put into place about removing statues is that, well, it's about free speech, right? And people often say that, hey, it's about free speech because this speech isn't dangerous and it doesn't incite to violence, because that's one of the restrictions on the idea of free speech under the First Amendment, right? But the reality of having a statue, having it be this kind of memorial, monument, whatever it is, having it just there enforces this default narrative about history, about what's important, enough to pick out and put up a monument, right? For us, right now, the discussion around racism is that it's a thing of the past, right? It's a thing of the past, it's in the past, it hasn't, we've overcome it. That's kind of the dominant narrative about race, that it's an issue that, we faced a long time ago, it's no longer the same, we don't have slavery anymore, we elected a Black president. All this rhetoric around it is trying to place this kind of artificial division in time that's now saying that these statues are just a relic of the past and has no consequence on what people are understanding about the current system. But something like a statue is part of the larger, broader narrative about what is history in this country. And the phrase is often, history is written by the winners, right? And we have this very skewed understanding in our textbooks, in our media, in art, in all kinds of different forms of representation as to who is American, who speaks for America, who represents the best of America. All these different things that really erase the existence of multiple different people of color, right? And it puts into place that some of these people who are influential are the main people that we should be centering. A plaque does not provide the proper context for describing this person's role, right, in history and enforcing some of the issues of segregation and other racism. Now, when we think about human rights education and training specifically, the idea is that racism isn't taught by osmosis. Because you're hearing the terms white supremacy or something just on TV or in a book doesn't mean you've automatically gained the knowledge surrounding issues of human rights violations. It's not something that because you're hearing the phrase Black Lives Matter, that you automatically suddenly understand this history or that you automatically have an understanding of the systems that exist. Somebody needs to teach you that. And why do they need to teach you that? So we don't repeat it, right? And so we move away from it. The United States is interesting in the sense that for other countries, so the United Nations has a declaration on human rights education and training, and they specifically talk about racial justice issues within that declaration. Other countries, because they have seen the impact of dehumanization, systemic dehumanization of certain groups of people within their borders, because they've seen the impacts of that, which have resulted in things like genocide and other very, very severe consequences, have decided that they want to take more efforts to teach people about this because they don't want it to happen again, right? The idea is that it's never again. Here, however, the closest thing we have to a standardized curriculum or a national curriculum or a national push to actually educate about the history of race is Black History Month. And this is not a federally mandated thing, right? Teachers are not required to teach this. There is no standardized national curriculum that they have to cover certain items within that month. And they could spend a day just talking about Martin Luther King and I Have a Dream speech and then just leave it at that, right? So overall, we then have a population that is heavily undereducated about issues of race and racism. And then within that context, to have these statues up indicating that these are people that we should be learning about, that are important to our understanding of who we are as a nation, of who we are as citizens, of people to possibly emulate because, hey, there's a statue of this person, reinforces that this is the narrative of the country that we are in. And continuing to keep these statues up suggests that we are still in this place where we are celebrating these values that these people held. So we're in a situation where we're not educating against the ills and the wrongs that they committed. Instead, we're just kind of leaving it up and acting as if it has no impact on the modern day. But as we see, we're seeing mass incarceration issues, police brutality, even in Michigan specifically, issues around transportation, access to water. Something as fundamental as water, there are racial issues around water. And so to act as if these ideas are just in the past and that they can't currently incite violence, which systemic racism is ultimately a form of violence towards certain people, misses the entire reality of race and racism in the country today. So these statues, I don't think, are just neutral or harmless because they're enforcing a certain narrative and enforcing certain ideas and ideals of what we should be kind of aspiring to as citizens. So I think under like these First Amendment free speech concerns, that argument that people often make that this doesn't incite to riots, I don't think that's true. And I think seeing kind of what's going on with white supremacist neo-Nazi networks and all of that right now, we can see that this isn't true, that it's just going away on its own.
Okay. Always bad to go last with a bunch of PhDs to your right? People who've spent a lot more time thinking about this than I have. I figured what I might bring to the conversation tonight is something that I've been thinking a lot about lately in the context of not just statues, but all of the sort of systemic infrastructure of inequality and racism. I'll tell a quick story. So my son is 14 years old, and I'm about to teach him to drive. The reason I'm going to do that is because when I was 14, that's what my mother did. She said, you don't learn to drive in driver's ed, you learn to drive from your parents. She took me out on Belle Isle every Sunday at like 6 a.m. when no one else was out there. And she would get out of the driver's seat and I would sit there and she would teach me about all the instruments on the dash, and eventually I would drive the car around the island and through the park and all those kind of things. So I'm going to do the same thing with my son. But I remember as much from my mother teaching me to drive about the sort of tangibles of driving, right? How to make the car work and be safe with it. I remember just as much as that, the sort of intangibles of driving she told me about. And one of them was about the places that I might go in the car. We lived in downtown Detroit, and I had friends because I went to U of D high school. I had friends all over the metro area, suburbs way, way, way out in other places. And I remember the first time we talked about when you're driving down Jefferson, East Jefferson, headed toward Grosse Pointe, and you cross Alter Road. What my mother told me, you always, always take your foot off the gas and put it over the brake. because you always want to be able to slow down immediately if you see a police officer or if you just feel like somebody is watching you. You always take your foot off the gas, put it over the brake at Alta Road. She said the same thing to me about Michigan Avenue. And as you go, I think it's across Wyoming, into Dearborn. She said, don't have your foot over the accelerator, have your foot over the brake so that you can slow down below the speed limit. Don't worry about what the speed limit is, just be going slower than everybody else in order to not attract attention to yourself, because you will attract attention. In a car, by yourself, you're a 16-year-old black man looking like a black man, you will get harassed. So I'm thinking to myself now about how I'm going to teach my son to learn to drive. And we're going to go to Belle Isle, and he's going to learn about all the practical, tangible things about driving. But I'm going to say the same thing to him in 2018 that my mother said to me in 1984. Wow. And you think about that. That's 34 years. 34 years later, I have to have the same conversation, and I probably have to have that conversation a little bit more urgently with my son than my mother had to have with me. There were not a whole lot of instances when I was learning to drive of police shooting innocent black men on the side of the road in Metro Detroit. I mean, I'm not saying it wasn't happening then, but because of the differences in social media and all the sort of publicity and things, that wasn't a real concern of hers. Her concern was that they might rough me up, things like that. Now I got to think about, what might happen to my son in this car that crosses Alta Road or crosses Wyoming. And so and I use that as a way to talk about 34 years is a really long time to have to deal with the same kind of problem. Not just the same kind of problem, the same exact problem, the same exact issue as it pertains to race and inequality in this society. And so I've started to think about more and more, not just examples of this, which we all, I think, can rattle off for hours, examples just like that. Any person of color, especially, can tell you about the things that play out unequally in America. The question now, I think, is where are the points of disruption? Where are the things and what are the things that we can do to disrupt that pattern, which is not just 34 years old, right? It's 300, 400 years old. This is what we've sort of grown up around in this country, this idea that some lives matter less than others, that some people are not valued the same way others are. And what are the things that we can do, especially in 2018? We're post-legal segregation. We are post all kinds of milestones in terms of equality. What are the things that we still can do in order to, A, draw attention to those points of inequality, but B, move things in a different direction so that when my son is teaching his son to drive, and wherever that is, but he doesn't think instantly of this story. He doesn't think instantly of the need to pass that story down just as earnestly as, always turn your turn signal on. And I think it gets frustrating, I think, for people, both black and white, to keep thinking about these problems without coming up with or without coalescing around points of disruption, right? What can I do is always the question I think everyone asks themselves. And I think that relates to the Hubbard story and the monument story more generally as well. I'm not happy about the way that the controversy sort of emerged recently about Orville Hubbard. I'm not happy that, again, 34, 40 years after his death, that we're still talking about him. We're still talking about the things that he did, principally because Dearborn still struggles with some of the legacy that he left behind. But I do think that the plaque that Lester was talking about, and the words that he read from that plaque, start to move us in that direction. That is a point of disruption, right? That is a way of saying, okay, this has been this way for so long. Now we are going to go in a different direction. I think the fact that it is not out in front of City Hall is a point of disruption, right? It's not a major win. It's not going to change everybody's life, but it's a point of disruption. It's a point of diversion toward something that's at least a little more just than what we have been dealing with. As Josh said, I host the radio show each morning on WDET called Detroit Today. We talk about inequality a lot on the show. This week, one of our senior producers had an interview with Mitch Landrieu, who is the mayor of New Orleans, the outgoing mayor of New Orleans. He's going to leave in May. But he's written a book recently, and it's called In the Shadow of Statues, A White Southerner Confronts History. And it's about his efforts to get rid of the Confederate monuments in New Orleans. And it's a really interesting book. I would encourage people to go. I skimmed it this week, and I think he did a really great job with it. Also, just FYI, and you heard it here first, that guy is running for president in 2020, almost certainly. I mean, you listen to people talk about stuff, and you know sort of who they are.
That's going to be interesting.
I think that's going to be one of the Democratic contenders, and I think that has to do with how much he's talking about this book too. It's a little cynical, but but the earnest part of what he did, and the earnest part of this book, that second part of the title, A White Southerner Confronts History. I mean, African Americans have been talking forever about the inappropriateness of Confederate statues, right? We know that's not okay. We know that's an homage to our dehumanization. There's no other way to characterize it. But a lot of people don't listen when African Americans say that. And it's too easy still to say, well, that's their perspective on it. And even if you believe that African Americans have a right to that perspective, in a lot of the cases, people believe, well, it's okay to just disagree with them. Then we get to the whole free speech issue. Why can't we just have this, and you can have your opinion about it, but we're still going to keep it? A white mayor in a majority black city in the South, a white mayor who is, the son and grandson of a huge political dynasty in Louisiana that at times has been in the right place on civil rights, sometimes they haven't been. For him to stand up and say, I don't like this, I don't think this is okay, and we're going to get rid of it. And I'm not going to indulge the both sidesism. I'm not going to indulge the idea that there's another legitimate argument to make here. I'm just going to take them down. That's huge. That is a huge point of disruption in that city and in the country. And that's not to, of course, denigrate any of the efforts that African Americans are making. I mean, Kathy Pugh, who's the mayor of Baltimore. Baltimore, by the way, I believe this is true, has more Confederate monuments than any other major city in America. They are everywhere in Baltimore, and a lot of them are just sort of thrown all over the place, like on the sides of the freeway, overgrown with grass and stuff. I mean, no one takes care of these things at all. And Baltimore was a city that would have been part of the Confederacy if not for Lincoln sending Union troops very early in the war to occupy Baltimore. People don't always realize that the Mason-Dixon line is between Pennsylvania and Maryland. Yeah. Maryland's part of the South. There are lots of people doing this, but someone like Mitch Landrieu standing up and saying, I am part of the disruption, I am part of the pushback to this is huge. And I think increasingly we all have to start thinking about what are the things we can do that are disruptive to this infrastructure. And sometimes it's little stuff, sometimes it's big stuff. For a while, I can confess this now because because I have less responsibility in the world. I was thinking for a time last year about, I told Lester about this, we had this conversation. I was thinking for a time last year about whether I would stop pulling over for the police. Just say, you know, I don't trust you enough to pull over by the side of the road and take my chances about whether you might beat me up or kill me or whatever. And then encourage other African Americans to do the same. What about that kind of disruption? What would that achieve? Would that get us into the space where we can at least talk about what this looks like if you are African American? Now, I'm not encouraging anybody to do that. Let's be clear about that, right? Lester was one of the few people I told about that, and I remember his reaction being, maybe you just do that as a thought experiment. But I think even as a thought experiment, it can be disruptive.
Yeah, I said write it up as a thought experiment. Write it up, because that's when you had the vehicle. I didn't just say, like, think about it. I didn't just say, think about it hard.
But I mean, I think that kind of thought, we have to get to that space, and you don't want to put yourself or other people in danger, obviously. But I think we have to start talking about what are the ways that we make sure that our kids and our grandkids are not dealing with the same stuff that we're sitting here talking about today. You could have put this panel together 50 years ago, right? And everyone would say the same things. That's not okay. And that's not to say we haven't had progress. It's just progress now, I think, depends on more discrete, purposeful pushback to some things that again, are not as easily identifiable as a law that says black people can't live here or black people can't go here. That's not what we're dealing with. It is the things that John Pat and Lester and Namira, I'm sorry, we just met, are saying. It's the stuff they're talking about.
Excellent. All right. This is all really good stuff, because I was thinking about, and you guys have given me too much to think about, so we'll wrap it back around. I mean, there's a couple, all of you kind of touched on this idea of infrastructure, right, in a lot of ways. And we're talking both about immaterial and material infrastructure, the actual resource allocation and resource holding. And we're also talking about system and structures that we have. There's infrastructures of violence, systemic infrastructures of inequality, all of these pieces. And Lester and I were talking this afternoon, and I would like to hear him talk more about it with you guys as well. Right? In thinking about these infrastructures, we can talk a lot about the decline of Southeast Michigan. Right? We can talk about the decline of Great Lakes cities. We can think about all of those pieces. Yet at the same time, when we look at things like the subprime mortgage crisis, when we look at tax foreclosures, when we look at auctions, when we look at evictions, when we look at the way in which those impact neighborhoods and lives, they're incredibly racialized. They are tethered to these past practices and infrastructures that we're talking about, and they're transforming these spaces in new ways. So I guess what I would like for you guys to maybe try and tackle is what is the importance of kind of how is race, the role of race, shape the contemporary region in Southeast Michigan, and how is that either different, or how does that inform that national conversation that's going on right now? Because it is a much different national conversation than we would have been talking about in 2015 and then in 2013. We can go back, but it's 2008, right? It's much different now.
So there's one of the things that's interesting. I'm thinking about Stephen's comments about basically about language, right? So when she's talking about the power of stories to build infrastructure. So I want the students in the room, but those of you who consider yourselves lifelong students, to think about that. We take for granted the idea that that ideas have value in and of themselves, that there are these stories that transmit over time, that there's these symbolic practices that people engage in over time, that long live, that outlive in some instances their usefulness, but in some instances don't. So we can think about a city like Grosse Pointe or a city like Dearborn that's basically governed and structured by a set of laws. And we could think about them as also governed and structured in a way by like police that are designed to carry out those laws, right? But think about that story. And think about how many people are telling that story in 1984. I heard it. My dad talked to me about how I should carry myself when I was in Dearborn. And then think about the fact that you can go back 30 years before well, not 30 years, but let's say 30 years before 1984, and then 34 years after 1984, and still find people telling the same stories, right? Right? So we can think about laws, we can think about agents, but then think about think about those symbols, those stories, think about those monuments and how they work to kind of help create and police a certain type of racial space. Right, so I just want to put that out there. How does race work in the region? So when people think about the population decline in Detroit, the year people usually toss out as the year that the population started to decline in Detroit was 1967. And given that the census, didn't exist in 1967, there was no census in 1967 or 1970, they would say 1970. Right, that is, if you look at population over time in Detroit, it would go like this. Up to 1970, it would fall. Right? That's actually not the year population begins to decline in Detroit. Population begins to decline in Detroit when? 1950.
After 1947, right.
Yeah, so 1950. Why does it begin to decline? It begins to decline because you actually have a couple of federal pieces of legislation that opens up cities to populate, opens up the area outside of Detroit to what they want to do is create a new middle class. So the first thing is the Interstate Highway Act, which actually was a defense bill, right? It actually was a defense bill. And then the second thing was the GI Bill. The GI Bill gave veterans the ability to buy homes for cheap and develop homes for cheap, provided they were in the suburbs. You couldn't do it in the city, right? Now, if you combine these two dynamics with deep racial segregation, and what you do is you create a dynamic where, again, cities become racialized. In that same moment, we have the creation of a really robust private housing infrastructure, right? Where we could have gone more of a British way, where you have this really large public housing stock and then this private housing stock. They pretty much killed off public housing for the most part. And what's the consequence of that? In as much as that's where middle class folk get their wealth from, you end up embedding a material, there's a material incentive for people to live in places where their houses could accrue in value, right? Now, when the federal government gets into the housing business, because only by federal government injecting itself into the housing business could you actually have a market in the first place, they have to figure out how to distinguish risky markets from non-risky markets, right? Because they had to back the loans, right? How did they determine which neighborhoods were risky? From redlining. See, this is why they shouldn't let 10-year-olds go. It's like massive. Redlining. So you create a dynamic where race and housing are connected. And then you create a dynamic where whites, outside of their attitudes, are invested in living in neighborhoods that are majority white. You go to Baltimore, you go to Detroit, any place that actually has redlining maps, you could see, and they said, the government said, any space, any neighborhood that has a high population of black folk, we're gonna deem as a red. Now, they didn't use that type of language, but it was about as explicit as you could get, right? Now, how can we connect that story to now? When we look at all these spaces, we can almost directly map red line neighborhoods to Malfair. Definitely could do it in Baltimore. You can connect that to a number of missed moments as far as radical politics. There was a moment where the unions were really pushing left, but then they stopped. There was a moment where we were pushing for national health care, and then we stopped. You can connect a lot of those missed radical moments to the influence of race just in those three policies alone, right? And then, of course, when we move it all the way up, we think about Homeboy owns 90 buildings in Detroit. Yeah, Dan Gilbert. Yeah, Dan Gilbert owns like 90 buildings in Detroit. He has his own private police downtown. Yep. He has his own private security force. He has his own camera dynamic. That's a process. The only ways he could buy those buildings if you have severe real estate devaluation. Why do you have severe real estate devaluation in one of the major international ports on the face of the planet? Maybe it's because the population. Why is it that every city with a majority black population in the state of Michigan either has or has had emergency financial management? How does that work out? One argument could be that as black people don't know how to govern themselves, but I'd actually argue that if you look over time, it's a combination of race, kind of private property, and then local government decisions. So I'm gonna got more with you.
Let's give everybody else a shot.
I mean, one way to look at race in the region is to sort of, and this does make us stand out from some other places, right? And this is not just the region, this is the state. So we have 577 school districts in the state of Michigan. Oh, wow. Each little nook and cranny of every city really has, especially when you get to the metro area, has their own school district. Why is that true? We never talk about like the origins of those decisions to make a tiny little school district somewhere. Why does the city of Warren, for instance, I think they still have 4 or 5 school districts in that city. If you trace the creation of those districts to their sort of origin, I mean, you get to separation, right? We want to get away from those other people and create our own space. What you were talking about, Lester, hoard the resources that we have here and make sure other people don't get them. By contrast, the state of Maryland, which is not nearly as big as the state of Michigan. There's about 3 million people in Maryland. There are about 9 million people in Michigan. But Maryland, the whole state, only has 13 school districts. They're organized by county. Now that creates all kinds of other dynamics, and race confounds that as well in that community. But it's not the same as what we have here. It's not to the degree that we have here. We have 1,800 municipalities in the state of Michigan. In most of Maryland, there's no such thing as a municipality. The smallest form of government throughout most of Maryland is county government. Imagine if Wayne County were what governed your trash pickup, for instance, and police. You might not like it as much because you might feel like it's further away, but the truth is it would put a lot more of us in the same boat, right? Common interests, which sometimes are able to overcome racial animus or isolation. And so there's a lot about the way we have organized government and the structure of government in this state that reflects that idea of otherness, that idea of separation, that idea, like Lester was talking about, of hoarding resources. And again, let's talk about points of disruption. If I were to go to one of those 5 school districts in Warren and say, hey, you know what? How about this city only had 1 school district, right? Let's just take all these lines y'all have drawn and get rid of them and mash you all together and divvy things up that way. you would get a fight not just from the majority white districts, you would get a fight from all of the districts, right? Everybody has bought into the idea that local control, hyper-local control, is better, even though it is an unbelievable aggravator to racial division. Imagine if I went out to the Grosse Pointes. There are 5 Grosse Pointes, 5 municipalities, right? Each one with a city council, each one with its own police department, 2 of them with their own court. If I went to the Grosse Pointes and said, if I went to Grosse Pointe Farms and said, you know, you and Grosse Pointe Shores and Grosse Pointe City and Grosse Pointe, you all should be one place. I've had this conversation. People's fists clench, and I mean, people get really worked up about that. But it's not because they're racist. It's not because, in that case, you're not even talking about race, right? All of the Grosse Pointes are still majority white. It is this sense, though, of hoarding. It is this sense of keeping other people away, and it traces back to race. Now it plays out in all kinds of other dynamics. Like I said, African American communities make this argument just as strongly as white communities do. It makes no sense. And if you want to talk about points of disruption, let's talk about that. Let's talk about the structure of government. You know how much more it costs us, by the way, to have 577 school districts as opposed to, we don't have to get down to 13, but let's just do it by county. That would get us to 83, right? Think of how much better we could manage things if we did that. But again, you can't get people into that space anymore partially because of race, but because of this ingrained otherness that we want to assign to anybody who's not, you know, I live on this side of the street, you live on that side of the street. We got nothing in common. There's so much of that in this community and this state.
Am I allowed to ask a question?
Sure.
Can I add something? Can I
Yeah,
add
yeah,
something
go
to what
ahead.
you're saying first? I think the issue of resources is really crucial to a lot of this, because ultimately what happens when you have, well, if we're thinking back to like the dehumanization process, it's like, why do this, right? Like, what is the benefit to dehumanizing a group of people by ethnicity or by race or religion or whatever it is? Why do that in the first place? And part of it is because there's that aspect of resources, right? If you can dehumanize a group and say that they are more property than they are people, you can put them in that role of getting free labor, right, from this group of people. And ultimately, having this kind of setup means that you are getting resources off of people's labors and off of the activity that they're doing. So when we look at Detroit versus the suburbs, we still have cities in the suburbs who are paying way under market rate for water from Detroit, and yet Detroit is poor. You know, there are resources in Detroit that the suburbs are still benefiting from today, but the resources aren't being flowed, there is not an exchange of value that is going back into Detroit. So there's still this exploitation that is happening of these cities, of these resources. I mean, water. We have suburbs who are underpaying for water, while the city government is shutting down people's water for $200 bills in Detroit. Or less, yes, absolutely. Foreclosing on homes. All this kind of, and this is the thing about the narrative around the dehumanization, is that what is the narrative? Oh, Detroiters can't manage their money. Yeah. They're spending money on cable or phones or whatever instead of on their water. And that is what is being used to sell this existing system. Because if the reality was that without this dehumanization, if you actually had neighbors who you were talking to, you know, I mean, the statistics are what, like over 90% of white people don't have a non-white friend? That's how bad it is. So you have a situation where the only information you're getting, whether it's about Latinos, about Muslims, about black people, about the intersections of all those identities, is from the news or from other media that paints a very specific narrative most of the time, and you don't have these neighbors, you can justify all kinds of exploitative and oppressive policies that way. And Michigan is very unique in the sense that we are a kind of testing ground for a lot of these policies. I mean, Betsy DeVos, for example, you know, people are trying things here emergency management. People are trying policies here that are then getting exported to other places. The bankruptcy foreclosure situation in Detroit, there were corporate executives from Puerto Rico who came up and had meetings with Detroit corporate executives, figuring out how to do this. And so you have this use of money and resources to also export these kind of policies to other places, and that's really important to keep in mind, given what's happening on that national scale.
Yeah, on that question of resources and dehumanization, and also to Stephen's point about school districts. I mean, I was thinking, the political transformation that it would require to have not just like a Grosse Pointe school district, but imagine like a Oakland County school district, or imagine a Tri-County school district. The kind of political transformation that would require is, I mean, it's daunting, and sometimes it seems it would require either like a revolution or the apocalypse, or whichever one came first.
I wrote when I was in college, and Lester will appreciate this story, I took the intro English class, and I had to write an essay once about some solution to a problem, right? And I said, the problem of unequal school resources distribution in Metro Detroit. And I proposed this idea of a super district, right? It would be Wayne, Oakland, and Macomb, and you would be able to go back and forth across this.
You had it all worked out.
And I got a B- on the paper because the professor, Ralph Story, wrote totally unrealistic. He slammed it. He was like, this is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. He's like, you cannot sell that to anybody.
I mean,
And that was in what, 1988?
and to a degree, in a sense, he was right to give you B- for that. But of course, the standards of what's realistic is not, those change, and people have the power to change the meaning of what's realistic. But I mean, I was also just struck by, in thinking about, just to go back to Hubbard for a second, the famous slogan that he's associated with, "Keep Dearborn clean." That's a statement, again, as well about infrastructure, as well as obviously a statement about racism.
Yeah.
But it's striking that, the thing that a segregationist such as Hubbard stands for, presumably, is the purity and integrity of whiteness.
Yeah.
But it's something, you would think that for somebody like that, they would be able to define that thing better than just saying clean,
Yeah.
Because clean is just the absence of something. It's a negative category. It doesn't have any content. There's nothing to it. It's just the absence of something else. And that's, it goes a long way to saying what Hubbard's appeal, I think, appealed to. What Hubbard appealed to is a notion of whiteness that's defined in terms of what it's not, which isn't to say that, white people don't have any content, but that whiteness as an idea, as an ideology, as a structure, as a choice, as a political structure entails. And that's something that's and once you sort of just subject that to the slightest bit of scrutiny, it's like there's nothing there, there's nothing to it, that idea of cleanliness. And so, that's some elements of the structure we're talking about seem daunting, and then others just seem like paper thin. But I was kind of wondering, and maybe this is a question that people can reflect on in the audience too, is what is the kind of successor to Keep Dearborn Clean? Like, what is Dan Gilbert's version of that? Because he doesn't have, or
That's a great question.
Mike Dugan, or any, or any politician doesn't have the ability to tax the hell out of Ford Motor Company and bring in those resources to, keep Dearborn clean. So
Make
what's
America
the version
great.
of it now?
Make America great.
Oh yeah.
Again, I'm sorry. Make it great.
Oh yeah. It's so obvious. Why didn't I think?
So we'll leave, this is a great comment. We'll leave John's past question here. We have about a half hour left. So I think what we'll do is we'll grab a couple questions. I will try and hold our panelists to a few minutes, and then we'll grab a couple more. How's that sound? John, you had one?
To the point of both resources and disruption, it occurs to me that we have, across the board, we've bought into our own dehumanization to the point where we need every new manufactured item in order to feel good about ourselves. And to that degree, we allocate resources to ourselves and away from others to be what we think is human. And so the point of disruption to that would be to create real human community and to refuse to participate in the destruction of that humanity.
I was just wondering what your guys' thoughts were on race and mobility in the region. Not just geographic mobility in a sense, like with the I know we had the failed regional transit plan in 2016, and then just sort of also upward mobility too. So I guess I was wondering how you guys thought race affected that.
Did you have a question up there?
No, I got one. Health and racial disparities, I mean, what do you guys think about that in terms of how it plays into the current time?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah.
All right.
All right.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you, I appreciate it. I'm curious about this concept of disruption, because I think that's you talked about disruption, you said it's not, you're thinking about it in a way that it's not a major win, it's not going to change people's lives. It just makes things a little more just. And that's something that I think is qualitatively different than my conception and some people's conceptions, and for the Black radical tradition, Black political thought, their concept of disruption.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about that in the broader context of white supremacy as an ideology, but also as a political system. And it seems to me that that kind of concept of disruption allows for the maintenance of that system and the perpetuation of that system. And so for me, I'm much more concerned about what I'm trying to understand how you reconcile that position with what seemed to be a position that you held at the beginning, which was a criticism of institutional white supremacy, institutional discrimination, and inequality that's maintained institutionally throughout 400 plus years. For me, that's a very, so I would be curious to see your response to that and hear how you work through that.
That's four big ones, right? So we've got a response, right, to the critique. Disruption.
So I should probably talk a little more about what I mean by disruption, right? This came out of the conversation that I started in the middle of last year with a couple of close friends about the frustration that I had that I don't see disruption. And I do mean something quite different from let's go and demonstrate somewhere, let's go and have speeches and protests and things like that. And I'm not denigrating any of that. I think all of that is important and necessary. I'm talking about the ways in which you can disrupt those systems so that the consequences of them don't keep meeting out on people of color and other people in this society. And I'll give you an example. In the last 3 or 4 years, I have become much more attached than I have been at any point in my adult life to the neighborhood where I was born, which is near Livernois and Grand River, and the house that my family lived in when I was born. And there's a big project around it now, and we have a nonprofit operating there that's a writer's residence and a literary center and all these sort of really interesting things. But of course, over that time, we've become much closer with the neighbors on that block, the 7100 block of Tuxedo, which is one of the worst places in that side of Detroit. It's just as a point of reference, there are 40 parcels on that block. When I was a kid, there were 40 houses. Right now, 24 of those houses are empty and abandoned, stripped, blighting the block, right? And each year, they add a couple more through the tax foreclosure process, right? So I've taken my house and 2 other properties on the street and tried to move them in a positive direction. That's 3. This fall, 5 went into the tax auction and got auctioned off. So for all of the effort, all of the money that I've raised to move things in a different direction in that neighborhood, for the first year we're minus 2, right? But when I deal with the things that my neighbors bring to us on that block, I mean, I think about the mother who lives at the end of that block, who grew up there and moved across the street into a house that she could squat in because her father, she couldn't live with her father anymore. And I think of the mold that's on the walls in that house, and the 3-year-old she has living there with her, the inability that she has to get a job, the inability to do things to take care of her son. And I think about her father, who lives across the street, who probably bought his house in the 80s or 90s and has seen all of the value gone away. I think of the house where I was born, where my godparents bought a duplex. My family lived upstairs and my godparents lived downstairs and owned it. They bought it in 1960 for $30,000. He was an auto worker and was able to get a house for $30,000 in a neighborhood where blacks were not allowed until the 60s. I bought that house in 2016 out of the land bank for $500. So all of the intergenerational wealth that should have been generated from that purchase in 1960 is gone, just gone. And so I guess when I say disruption, I'm trying to find, and it's more a searching term for me than a definitive term. I'm looking for, what do you do? What do you do on that block? What do you do for this woman who lives at the end of the block? What do I do for the woman who lived next door to me who owned her house, fell behind on the taxes? It was the only asset she had in the world, but she couldn't figure out the taxes or the payment plan, couldn't fill out the paperwork to get the exemption, which she was qualified for, and so they took the house. So she has no assets, right? So the only asset she had was taken from her. I'm trying to find the point of disruption to say that in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years, that block is again the kind of place where I grew up, where we weren't rich, right? It was a working class neighborhood. But there was opportunity. There was opportunity for me. There was opportunity for other folks on that block to grow up and go to college and go off and do all these interesting, wonderful things in the world. And you know, the example I used of me saying, I'm not going to pull over for the police anymore, I think is more in the tradition of what you're thinking of in terms of disruption, the sort of direct challenge to oppression. And institutional, that's right. I don't think it's an either or, but I am still searching for how that disruption changes the lives of now people who I see and interact with and care about every day, right? I'm frustrated that the things that I see on TV, the things that I read in the newspaper about this moment don't seem to reach down there. And so I should have phrased it more in terms of that question and that searching, because that's how I feel.
I feel like that question also goes to the upward mobility question,
It does.
about whether, I mean, that's something where it's like staying in that neighborhood, it's like downward mobility just by staying in that neighborhood.
It is.
Which is all about that systemic kind of what's happening around it. My organization, Muslim ARC, we've been a virtual organization for 4 years, but we actually just bought a house in the land bank in the Linwood-Davison area, because we want to
It's
do
not far from us.
yeah, so we want to do training out of there, and there's an organization called Dream of Detroit that is in that neighborhood. It's around the Muslim Center, which is, you know, one of the largest mosques that's in like Detroit proper, a black majority mosque. So that neighborhood's the same deal, where we've got empty lots where the houses have been stripped, people who've lost their homes. And for us too, there's this question of gentrification versus development in a neighborhood, right? And this idea about upward mobility, right now, it's almost like the only ways to gain upward mobility are to buy into these systems of white supremacy, essentially, which is what that pattern of, you know, non-black people of color following the white flight kind of patterns and being allowed to do that without decreasing property values falls into that too, right? And it's kind of like, who is being given access to upward mobility financially, whether it's through restrictions about different laws, geographically or otherwise. How does that work? And it's kind of like the whole thing is set up to fail certain people intentionally because other people are benefiting off of that. So I think it is really important to think about both like the geographics and then that dehumanization, the narratives, along with this question of mobility.
I mean, it's why we need new metaphors for these things, because upward mobility, you know, you move up, someone's still down here. I mean, and you climb the ladder of opportunity, there's still a bottom rung, and someone's still
We were
stuck
climbing
there.
on the backs of other people to get there.
Right. So, and that relates to the question about physical mobility and the ways in which that is a consequence of the hoarding Lester talked about. The ability to keep people out of Dearborn, or the ability to restrict the movement of people into other parts of the region is a part of maintaining that kind of hierarchical ladder that if we're thinking in terms of equality, we need a new term for that.
I'm going to go back to Stephen's thought experiment because it's important. So when he gave it to me, I was like, write it up, right? And the reason I said write it up was because I have in mind a theory of political action that's based on public work, right? So there was a moment when folks on the left, whether you're talking about Marxists or black radicals, thought that if we do this, then the revolution will come, right? Then there's this moment somewhere after the neoliberal turn, or after, the 1970s or so, definitely after the fall of the Soviet Union, where people realized, well, you know what, this revolution thing is going to be more complicated than we thought it was. It's not going to be just do X and Y, right? But my theory is that public action has these ripple effects that we can't actually predict, particularly when they're combined with institutions. So if you combine his seemingly reformist housing project, which he has written about, with this thought experiment, and let's have a thought experiment that he wrote the thought experiment up. You
were the one who wanted me to do it.
Yeah.
Other people were like,
I was like, write it up, because then you'd have a model, and then people, what would happen, it would trigger an idea, and people would say like, damn, I never thought about doing something like that. Maybe I should try it. And then maybe people try it and it doesn't work. Maybe people try it and improve upon it and modify it.
So the reason I didn't do that was not because I don't trust Lester. I do. But I had a conversation with the ACLU about it. And I said, what if I did this? What would you do in response if they arrested me, or if they
Like high-speed car chase.
And I said, I just want to know. And their response was that they would not be able to defend me legally in those actions. It was defying the law, and it's not an unjust law. It's an unjust application of the law. But they also were concerned that if I had written that in the Free Press, for instance, that it would inspire other people who are not me to do it, and the danger for them would look really different.
No, I'm not tripping on Steve's decision not to do that. What I'm suggesting is there's a theory of public action.
Yes.
Right? I have a theory of public action. I think a number of us do. Public action is different than private action. If people can see it, it has all types of ripple effects. Right? I mean, how many of us have given talks in some public space, and then somebody years later is like, oh my God, that changed my life. And you don't even remember what you said. right? Politically, particularly in a moment where we don't know what's going to work, we need as much of that improvisation, public act as possible, from reformist all the way to radical, right? So that's how I think that's important. And then that gets to the affect dynamic. What he's talking about when he's talking about like how many times do we get caught up in Facebook or Twitter likes, or we get in a flame war, or we're caught up in our phone. There is this affective thing that allows capitalism to function, or that in part allows capitalism to function. That is not that we have an interest in buying something, it's that this object makes me feel a certain way and feel better about myself, even though it doesn't, right? It doesn't quite work like that. Right? So what I'd say is that one way to do that, and this is reformist, but if we're talking about small, is you create kind of cell phone free spaces, right? Like where that's actually the thing, because I'm really betting that a number of us probably do want at least spaces where we can say, you know what, damn, I never thought about this. This is I'm kind of addicted to this thing, and I need to put this away. Right? And you create spaces like that, and then that gives you more opportunity for conversation. Health disparities. Derek, my man, what's up? First wedding I ever attended. First wedding when I was a kid. That was so dope. Like 1978, 79. Give y'all a shout out. When you think about health disparities and local space, so you could think about Inkster, where I grew up. Right, where you're talking about a combination of infrastructure dynamics, where our neighborhoods aren't necessarily safe to be in physically, and then those have certain type of health effects. But then there are also a set of mental processes, right? Whether you're a kid, so I grew up right around the time, one of my reasons my parents moved from Inkster was because Inkster started getting violent. Right, and I take this for granted now, but a number of people I knew had gotten killed when I was a kid. That's kind of sort of not supposed to happen. We take that for granted. That generates stressors. It generates stressors on the kids. It generates stressors on the parents. Potential encounters with police generate stressors, and we see that in statistically significant differences in stress loads between black populations and other populations. So simply put, and that extends over time. There are poor neighborhoods in Baltimore that have life expectancies similar to the third world, where just a couple of neighborhoods away, you have people with life expectancies in the 70s or 80s. Disruption, health disparities. Yeah, race and mobility. I'll just talk about the guy. I remember the guy, like the first paper I read every day, even though I'm in Baltimore, it's a free press. I remember reading about the guy who walked like 20 or 30 miles to work back and forth. Yeah. So one of the ways that race works is race helps racism reduces support for certain types of public services. Racism reduces public support for welfare. Racism reduces public support for rehabilitative methods in dealing with crime. Racism reduces support for transportation across district lines. Right? So it's not a coincidence that the way we problem solved this specific instance was not, wow, we need to vote for something that enables this guy to get to work. It was buy him a car. It was straight up charity, right? We could think about the Flint project in the same way. The political project is, wow, Flint should have an infrastructure that gives them clean water. But the political solution to that, because the way race and public services go together, was, whoa, we need to get people bottles of water. And this is black folk doing this, right? So yeah, those are my answers.
I want to piggyback on something the legislature was talking about, public action. One of the things I've been thinking about also is public speech.
Yeah.
And the way public speech has changed over time, and the way that social media and 24-hour news cycles have changed public speech. And in particular, because I'm a writer, I've been thinking about this idea of the public essay, right? An essay in the really classic sense of the French word essai, which is to test or to try.
Yeah.
The whole idea of that is to put things out there that maybe you don't think are going to work,
Right.
or maybe you haven't thought completely through. Thus my don't stop for the cops. I was going to have, that was going to be my little signs in the window. Won't stop for cops. I thought a lot about this. There should be space for that, right? There should be a space for that as a thought experiment. Without the potential for, I mean, I have no idea what the police would have done if I'd written that, essay, what their response might have been specifically to me. There should be space, though. We should, as a society, we should want to be able to have that discussion, right? Without it being a challenge to order or whatever you want to call it. It should be, hey, what about this? What about this idea? So I've been spending more time thinking about that question lately. Why don't we have those spaces? And could we create a space like that? Could we create a space like that in Detroit? Could we create a space like that in Michigan? Could we create a space like that nationally, where people are more free to test ideas? Ta-Nehisi Coates quit Twitter because there was no room to share unformed arguments, right? He said, anything I say, people take as that's what I'm going to do, or that's what I think the solution is, or I've thought it all through, and this is where I've arrived. He said, there's no space for me to try things. And I think a lot of people feel that way, and certainly if you are on social media, you can see it every day, the flaming and the bitter arguments that unfold that don't take us towards solution. They just shoot down any idea that doesn't fall within this very narrow idea of what's acceptable.
And that was kind of the initial ideas around free speech. I mean, it was supposed to be the marketplace of ideas, and that the good speech would drown out the bad speech. But nowadays, it's like there's certain value in specific narratives being pushed, right? Like millions of dollars into the Islamophobia industry to push narratives about Muslims. Certain stories being amplified throughout certain media outlets because there's a specific monetary, interest in pushing these stories about who is dangerous and what kind of surveillance we need, or what kind of weapons we need, or what the police need, or what the FBI agents need. So right now we have this artificial kind of marketplace where it's not really a marketplace anymore because the good speech isn't being kind of elevated to the point of drowning out bad speech. Instead, there's certain money going into elevating bad speech, right? But certain ideas, we can't even talk about it. And to be the millennial on the panel for a second, there was a post that I saw. It was a screenshot of like a Tumblr post. So the Tumblr post, and it goes back to the question about disruption, because they pointed out that, and I wish I could cite it, I don't have it on me, but they pointed out, like, in any time travel kind of show or something, the big thing is, like, oh, if you go to the past, like, don't change anything, right? Because it could change the entire future. And so the person on Tumblr was saying, okay, well, why don't we start thinking, like, modern days, that one small action that we could take today could completely change the future, right? We don't often think about it in that sense. So I feel like it's an interesting thing to tie these aspects together to have that. I mean, the other thing with like the creation of public space too, because we're talking a lot about ideas. I think it was Noam Chomsky who had a quote about like college graduates, graduating with so much debt. We're working 40 hours a week. Who has time to engage in these thought experiments or revolution or any of these things, right? And some of the psychology mechanisms around behavior change too is that if you have brain fatigue, you don't want to bother listening or learning about all these really hard to process topics because you're wiped out. You want to go to the movies or you want to go relax or whatever it is, right? Because you're just wiped out. So how do we get to a place where we're actually talking to people in ways where we're engaging with them given this context of overwork and the society that we live in where we are working nonstop to try and make ends meet sometimes or to buy the latest product or whatever it is that we feel that we need. And have this idea of space. And the disruption idea too for us, like for me as like somebody who is running a Muslim racial justice organization, Muslims are the most ethnically diverse faith group in the country, right? So you've got Muslims of all different ethnic backgrounds, but because of the way these narratives are, we get siloed. So me as the South Asian, I can pick either the AAPI space, right? The Asian Pacific Islander kind of space, Or I can pick the MENA, or the Middle Eastern, North African, Arab space, because that's where the Muslims are being put. And this is this weird artificial space where I don't have time necessarily to even be part of the organizing that's happening in both. So where are these spaces that are fitting within the silos, within the space between the silos? And so how do we create a space? And that's what my organization is doing, is because we're trying to create these spaces. Literally, our mission is create spaces and connect people across these multi-ethnic, multi-faith networks, because we don't have these spaces. And it's really, I think, kind of uprooting people in a way and not giving us that community to be able to talk to each other and to be able to organize together and to be able to disrupt and have this kind of sense of revolution.
Why don't you call this forum in campus marches?
It was booked.
That's dope. That's quick. Yeah, that's right.
No?
This is a public space, though.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got about five minutes left here. Kevin's been waiting. For questions.
Yeah.
I'm gonna
They
let
got
Kevin
questions.
throw his question out.
Yeah.
And then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah. And get another round. Get another round.
All right,
Quick
you want to do
though.
one more round?
Don't speechify. Quick.
So I was jotting down like kind of key phrases and stuff that one resonated with me personally and based off of what you guys were kind of talking about. So like for speaker one, you were talking about how the way statues are meaningless and stuff like that. And so one of the things I've actually got exposed to lately with working with like the 1967 rebellion projects for work is that majority of the streets around downtown are actually based off the names of slave owners. Belle Isle itself was also known to have Indian slaves and African Americans that were for I believe like people from Brush and Cass. But that in itself, and this is saying, what if we change those, take off those signs in a sense and kind of reestablish the way of saying, implementing different ethnicities, last names, and stuff like that, and the whole meaning. And then for speaker two, you were talking in a sense about growing up in Inkster, but going to schools here. And I'm pretty sure Ms. Eric is tired of me talking about this, but during the test, we had to talk about issues in regards to what does it mean, what is a ghetto? And so in that sense, now once I've ever actually heard of a trailer park being called a ghetto. And so that raises questions of exactly what is it that differs between a trailer park and say my community that people will consider a ghetto. I stay maybe like 10 minutes away from Grosse Pointe, but it's a complete stark difference. I grew up skateboarding and trying to like go over to Grosse Pointe because that's where I thought majority of the skateboarders would be. I was right, and since I didn't like it that much. But the key difference is that you have Mac and you have Chalmers, and so I get my haircut on Mac. It's my barber shop. But even then, just that side street is such a stark difference that from where I get my haircut, I still feel like I'm in Detroit. But when I cross over to Mac and I go into Grosse Pointe, there's still that one main street that still shows like regular houses that you see in Detroit. But now they actually just built a blockade that separates that one street.
Brother, we got questions. And it's like 5 to 8.
But yeah, so how do you feel about that?
Okay.
Speaker three, innocence of.
He's cutting you off, man. I think he's
So save the other questions.
yeah, they'll be here.
Because we're gonna be here. We're gonna be
Yeah,
here.
We're gonna be
Okay.
here after.
Other question about when it comes to deinstitutionalizing racism and maybe going straight to how can you approach it from the organization level, especially considering how they're like block clubs or neighborhood associations. And so my question would be, what would guidelines for justice look like? And I say this because often when we listen to language and movements, they normally speak of demands. But as, I'm sorry,
Numera? Yep.
as Namira had said, like a lot of people don't really know where to start, or they also need some education. So I feel like guidelines kind of is implicit about what are healthy actions or what kind of actions might lead to better outcomes. So that's an essay for you, Chad.
Okay, so do you feel like that kind of like a downfall of Detroit today within trying to improve the community is that Detroit itself is investing focus and resources more into profit than community? Like for example, like Little Caesars Arena riverfront development and the Hudson site, whereas projects such as like the Fitzgerald Revitalization Project and, you know, like Detroit Public Schools in general, like these resources can be moved to there. Along that line, like that's kind of where they're trying to help the community, but they're keeping it in the shadows, kind of thing.
So we have one more.
Yeah.
And
I
then
don't necessarily have a question, but just a quick comment. I've worked in Detroit in the construction business, union big construction. Little Caesars is actually a project that I just got done or I'm trying to close out. But I will say that, you know, besides looking at things in a local perspective, I know you mentioned about action, but when it comes to action, we need to work on all multiple levels. You know, you brought up the RTA bill. One of the reasons the RTA bill failed is because it was presented as, if you want the RTA bill, you have to pay more taxes. People don't want to pay more taxes, you're tired of paying taxes. But yet we reward big companies when it comes to LEED buildings. A LEED building is just more environmentally friendly. But we shouldn't be looking at it as a reward. Rather more, these is the technology that we have now. Because Little Caesars was 51% funded by taxpayers. Yeah, it's a private company. But when we look at big businesses and we say, hey, if you don't build this building with the technology that we have today, you pay higher taxes for that. The company itself. But no, it's not like that. We reward big companies when it comes to them being responsible. We shouldn't do that. You know, that's one thing that we have to change. But when it comes to action, we need to do it from a local level to a policy level. We need to change the way the system works. If we don't want to change the way the system works, then we have to be radical. But if you can't be radical, figure out what your capacity is. Get educated. Know what issues are in your community and how you can change them. But continue to build on that knowledge. Thank you.
all right. So you guys want to grab those last few?
Okay, I'll give you quick answers. Trailer Park versus Ghetto, that's a racialized project, but the political project about just adding different names. So what we have to do is think about different ways we can disrupt and make people think that alternatives are possible, right? How do we think alternatives? So changing the name of a street can be a project used to make us think about how other things are possible, how other worlds are possible. And this leads to the guidelines. I actually believe, and this is just me, but I believe in project-based political action, not necessarily guideline-based, right? So if you actually get people to have conversations about what material dynamics need to be changed in their local environment, right? And then get them to think about what type of systems they need to disrupt, what type of new cultural symbols they need to create, then I think you can generate more movement that way, right? Because the guideline-centered dynamic that's not project-based can easily lead to a dynamic where we're just in rooms talking to each other as opposed to engaging in action. And it's inevitably going to be not just action that changes the world, but it's going to be action that kind of gives us a sense on what's right and what's wrong. Detroit challenges profit versus community. You know, I hate to really get down like this, but I kind of wrote a book on it. But it's free. It's free. I'll give it to you. But basically, cities have changed since the 1970s, where they're basically incentivized to basically go for profit as opposed to other forms of urban meaning. Knocking the hustle against the neoliberal turn of black politics. Y'all just holler at me. I'll give it to you for free. Yeah, I think that get everything?
Yeah. Does anybody else want to jump in, or we want to
I mean, I think for me,
Yeah.
it's like some of the thinking about that, like the idea of education. I mean, human rights education and training is a very foreign concept of the United States, but that's kind of, for me personally, that's something that I'm really trying to develop and bring into it. But there's a number of resources. I mean, Safety Pin Box, The Daily Show did a feature on them out of Minneapolis. Paige Ingram, who works with them, is somebody who Muslim Mark invited out for a conference last year. They literally send out a box of education on race issues and then have a discussion, and like you pay for the box, and the idea is that it's in a box. It's like one of those daily boxes or monthly boxes that you can buy, right? It comes with books and education though instead. The Zinn Education Project is always talking about a people's history of the United States, and that goes into the street names because the idea is that these names have been erased and have not been featured in our public spaces. So the fact of reintroducing education, all of us, it's not as if we're in some neutral bubble where we're not absorbing information. So the older you get, the more you've absorbed, the more you have to unlearn and relearn information So for me, as an organization where we're providing some of this human rights education and training, that's what we're trying to do, is to figure out these ways to do workshops and trainings to provide the education in an accessible manner. And for us, I know we kind of do flow, I guess I do have to disagree, but we kind of do flow from principles into action, because we have two in particular that we use, and one is based off of a verse in the Quran, which is that we, the royal we, God created human beings into nations and tribes so that you may know one another. And that's a foundational principle for us of knowing one another in order to actually want for your brother what you want for yourself, essentially. And then the other aspect of that, too, is that this idea of allyship or of centering whoever is most affected by what's happening. So centering that voice, whoever that is on whatever issue, center the person most affected, let them call the shots. And so from those two principles, we come up with a lot of our workshops and strategy trainings and how we try to address, because at the end of the day, we could talk about this forever, right? So,
Okay.
yeah.
Cool. I mean, we are over. I appreciate everybody coming. There is a story map that complements this. It's available online. You'll find it at urbanpraxis.org. The students built that as well. We have a lot of food and drink outside. Panelists are going to stick around. Please join me in giving them a round of applause, and thank you so much.